All right, we're live. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today. I'm super excited about this conversation with Sally Carson, who used to be the head of design at Dual Security before it was acquired by Cisco. And she went up to head the design teams there at Cisco Security and eventually LinkedIn Jobs. And now she's currently a consultant as well as a leadership coach. And she's working on her first graphic novel, which is super interesting. And out of all these things, I'm actually really interested in your experience as a bike courier post 9/11 in New York City. But first, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah, likewise. This is a really, really personal topic for me about design maturity. But
hmm
anyway, bike courier, how was that? Was that like absolutely crazy in New York City?
It was so fun. It was like a formative experience for me. I think I was maybe like 22. I had been living in Virginia and I had gone up to New York City and signed a lease and came back to Virginia to kind of pack up my apartment and collect my things and get ready for the move. And then in the intervening weeks, 9/11 happened. And I had already put in my, no, I hadn't put in my notice. I was planning on working remotely. It was a very early remote job setup with my job in Virginia. And I decided to go up there anyway. Like people were thinking maybe you won't want to move to New York now, but as a 22-year-old, I was like, I want to go even more. Like it's such an interesting time to be there. Yeah, and it was a really exciting role. It was like I kind of think of it as like analog internet. Like we already had the internet there, but your job as a messenger is like sending packets from one node to the next in the most efficient way. So I was like, wow, we're like OG analog internet on the streets of New York. It was really fun. It was crazy dangerous. It was really hectic. But I love that feeling of like you get paid per job. So the faster you go, the smarter you are in terms of navigating the city.
Yeah.
Um, you make more money. So that was really satisfying.
This is pre-GPS, right? So
Yeah,
did
no
you have to,
smartphones. Yeah, no.
how
I had
did
a
you
paper
do
map.
that?
They gave us two tricks. Like so, well, one I lied about how well I knew the city, but luckily Manhattan's really easy. You know, it's pretty easy to navigate. But I had a paper map. We had Nextels, so just like live walkie-talkie style, two ways with you and your
Yeah.
dispatcher, and you could talk to other messengers, which was fun. But no smartphones. I had a regular paper map, which I almost never used, but then I just had this like pamphlet style one sheet that was pretty small. That's a map of Manhattan. I think they still sell them like at bookstores, and it just shows you like if you're trying to get to the 300 um, address of this avenue, it's between these cross streets or vice versa. So um, once you get to know, like, there's certain things you're going to have to look up on the map until you like memorize the city. So that thing was really handy. I could just keep it in a pocket.
That's amazing. So how long have you had you lived in New York City before you became a bike messenger? Like, it must have been
Like
just a
a
short
month
time.
or yeah,
A
month and
month.
a half maybe. And it was because I was trying to get other work. I had friends who were messengers in Richmond. That was a pretty popular job for like folks who were going to VCU where I went. So I was like friends with folks who were messengers. I had done some messenger work as a car courier in Richmond, and I loved it. And I'd been a pizza delivery driver, so I'd done some kind of adjacent work. And I'd gone up to the city thinking like it was this weird dream. I was like, maybe I'll be a messenger, but that sounds too crazy. And then in that post 9/11 world, I was trying to get other work. I was trying to get hired to do web stuff. And the role, this is interesting maybe for the audience, I don't know, but the role of the web designer was so diminished at that time that they were hiring like we're hiring an admin who can also be our webmaster. But the more important work is actually like the admin work that I was completely unqualified for. Um, and there wasn't any web work at all. And so then I tried to get service industry jobs and I couldn't get service industry jobs. They're like, yeah, it was a really rough time in the economy. And so you get to see sort of these like cycles continue. We had 2001, 2000 dot bomb crash, 2001, 9/11. So like the economy is completely tanked. And then we had it again in 2008. And now here we are in 2024. So these things are cyclical if you talk to the olds like me.
So you feel more confident that things will just bounce back in the next few years.
That's such an interesting question. If you'd asked me a year ago, I was like, yeah, this is just a cycle. Um, and I wish I had some data or some research to back it up, but something feels different this time. I don't think we're going to return to the days of like, um, just what it felt like to be an employee in tech in, let's say, the last 10 years. Like, I think like, I don't know if it's part of it is like the pendulum of power has swung back away from the workers, right? Back to like the
Yeah.
employers. Like we had a lot of power. Um, and you saw that coming through with like the great resignation and things like that. There's just not the war for talent because so many people are unemployed at the moment. I hesitate to talk about that. These are like gut level things that I'm experiencing, but I don't have like hard data to back it up. But if somebody in the chat does, drop us a link to a cool HBR article or something.
I wish we had more data about layoffs and how
Yeah.
that affects design, but all the data we have right now are pretty secondary, or they're more
Hmm.
extrapolated rather than any hard numbers.
Yeah.
But overall, I'm just so shocked that you went into it because I've lived in New York City since, I don't know, for like 20, almost 30 years now. And
Mm.
I still don't feel ready to be a bike messenger. I wouldn't know how to get from one place to another. I still rely on GPS. So you had no
Yeah.
GPS. You had been in the city for a month and you decided to be bike courier. One last question about that, because I know we want to
Yeah.
get into design maturity stuff, but did you have multiple packages for a
Mm-hmm.
single time? And then you would have to calculate like the most optimal route in your brain
Yeah,
before you
that
said,
part was
oh,
really fun. That was true for pizza delivery too. I love that part. Like that part, there's like a bit of like just getting to know the city and a bit of mathematics about like, I could go faster if I dump the heavier thing first, but makes more sense to go in this order. But yeah, you're picking up and dropping off simultaneously in different locations. So sometimes you're completely loaded up and you've got 40 pounds on your back. Sometimes you're just carrying like one thing. Um, and you have your dispatcher. So my dispatcher was like my helper, right? Like you
oh,
come in as a rookie and you get really bad work because you haven't proven yourself, because so many people come in and then quit because it's hard, especially with the when the weather's bad. But if you can prove yourself to your dispatcher and keep showing up on bad weather days and doing hard work, doing hard jobs and getting faster, like you show the commitment, your dispatcher is always going to help you, but they'll start serving you better jobs as well. But yeah, if you get stuck, you can be like, okay, I'm holding one for 16th, but I need to drop here. What order would you do that in? Usually the dispatchers have worked for years as messengers, so they have like an incredible map of Manhattan in their heads, and they can just run you through the order.
that's amazing. It's like being a recruiter, like an agency recruiter, and then you work your way up to be an account manager, so you can work on the
Uh huh.
client side, and you work with a bunch of recruiters, and you give them like crappy roles until
Dude,
they
are we
prove
like
themselves.
Are we real time like redesigning the role of the recruiter? What if you had an Nextel on your desk and people who you help land a job were like, Hong, I got a situation. This PM's being a real a-hole. What do I do? And you're like, okay, here's your move. Here's what you do next.
This is what Slack is for. You're in live
Yeah,
call, and
that's
you're just
true.
like, oh yeah, like what do I do? This person just like says something really inappropriate, and
Yeah.
they ask for this. Do I say yes to that? But I feel like there's this theme in your career where you do these things where, do you feel like there's a theme? Like where you might do something, you jump into something you might be
Mm,
unprepared for, and you just kind of figure it out and you do it.
yes. I
Yeah.
do that. And it's like it's not for everybody, right? It's like there's something in me that makes me do that and I enjoy that. And then sometimes I get in over my head and I'm like, what was Sally 3 months ago thinking? That's kind of how I felt when I was doing my startup. I was like, what was I thinking? If I'd known how hard it was, I wouldn't have done it. Um, but yeah, I have a weird combination of like sensation seeking, novelty seeking, and then I get overstimulated. So there's like cycles where I'm like, I need something new, I need a new challenge. And then I'm like, I'm stressed out, I did too much.
This is amazing. I actually forgot to mention that you co-founded your own startup, and
Hmm.
you gathered more than $1 million in VC funding as well. What's
Hmm.
that experience like?
That was tough. That was one of those examples of me jumping in and being like, sure, let's go for it. And with a lot of naivete, I really didn't know what I was getting into. I learned that originally my co-founder and I, we were just co-founders. And then eventually once we took VC, um, venture capital, the investors want a CEO because they want like one neck to wring is like a way I've heard them say
Yeah.
it. Like they want one person who's accountable. And so it was kind of sweet. Like neither my co-founder nor I wanted the role. We were both like, I don't really want to do that. Could we do co-CEO? That was too weird for the investors. We were trying to be very egalitarian. Um, but I ultimately ended up in the CEO role for a time, and that meant a lot of fundraising, which I found super unpleasant. So like I was not thriving in any way, like in any dimension of my life, I was not well. I was like not sleeping, I was working too much, I wasn't just having enough leisure time or time with friends. Um, However, and it took some recovery period. Like once I left the startup after a few years, it took me like kind of recovering my nervous system, for example. Um, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot, and I think it made me a much better employee in general. I thought I would never go back to being an employee. I really liked sort of doing my own thing, being entrepreneurial, which is part of why I liked being a messenger. Um, and that startup sort of punctuated this like demarcation. I'm about 24 years in tech, and the first 10 years, generally, I was like an IC, like UX designer, product designer. And then right in the middle is like I do the startup for a few years, I'm a CEO. And then the next 10 plus years, I'm in a leadership position. But I'm not advocating for anybody taking VC. I'm sort of like, VC is great in a very, very rare set of cases, but I generally advise against people taking VC because it's usually not necessary. Um, but it made me a much better employee, and it made me more sympathetic to CEOs who I reported up to and senior leadership. And I understood the pressures that they were under, the dynamics. And it's also, as an employee in tech, it's really helpful to understand how capital moves through tech and what the revenue
Hmm.
models for the businesses you're working for are.
So, as a designer, I usually have no connections or very little face time with the CEO
Hmm.
or anyone at the C level because there
Yeah,
often isn't a chief design officer. What's
right.
something that a senior IC like myself should be aware of so that we can better do our jobs as designers? Like, be more
Mm.
maybe empathetic to whatever the CEO or the C levels or VP levels are going through.
Yeah, that's really good. There's a lot, right? Like I think that could be a
Yeah.
whole that we could fill the rest of the time with that question. And I think it's a really important question because it's savvy, right? Like you want to be strategic about your career, um, and you want to understand the designers love context. I have like a joke about a drinking game. Anytime a designer says context, like take a drink of whatever the beverage is on your desk. But like
Yeah.
you need to understand the context of the business that you're working for and working in. And some of that, a lot of it starts with the revenue model. So it's like, is it a publicly held company? That's going to create a certain set of dynamics. Is it private? Is it a startup? Have they taken venture capital? That's unique from other private companies that haven't taken venture capital. Um, if they have taken venture capital, which is probably common for a lot of people on the call, I advise using Crunchbase to do research. They've locked up some of their data behind a paywall, unfortunately, but you can use it to look up the company you're working for, get a view of how much funding they've raised, how many rounds of funding. And sometimes you can see who the investors were. I have tips and tricks on that, on like using your VCs to build your network. We could talk about it later.
Hmm.
But that's helpful, right? It's like, is it a seed stage company? They've just gotten their first round of funding and you're the very first designer in the first 18 months? Because
Yeah.
you could call yourself head of design, but what you're really there to do is ship an MVP and try to help them iterate towards product market fit. Or is it a pretty mature stage and you're right on the precipice of trying to go for IPO or acquisition? That's going to create a totally different set of behaviors that you see with your leadership. So a lot of this comes down to like what like in our post we're like, maybe we'll talk about like, why is my boss doing this weird stuff.
Yeah.
I think understanding the revenue model for the business will help it'll help explain some weird behaviors, because it's a view into the incentive structures, right? Like you're trying to get an understanding of what are the incentive structures that are at place for CEOs and senior executives, and some of that comes down to like, how is a business expected to grow or make money.
Sure. So let's say Series A or C stage, they're hiring their first designer, and you're
Hmm.
the first designer on the team. You're working with several PMs and a boatload of engineers, and they're kind of,
Yeah.
they should have hired a designer maybe like a year ago. So
Hmm.
there's a massive amount of debt, and they're just kind of trying to get you to push through a ton of assets.
Hmm.
In that environment, which we can talk about, is that a design mature environment or not? But aside from that, what are the things that you should be more focused on that you might not be aware of as a designer in that
Mm.
scenario?
That's good. That's such one, it's such a common scenario, right? It's very, very
Yeah.
common. Two, it's really hard to be successful when you come into that role. But I'm glad we're talking about it because we're in an environment economically where people can't necessarily afford to be picky, right? So if that's the one job that
Yeah.
gives you an offer and you've been laid off for 6 months, take the role, like find a way. So Let's assume you can't be picky. Let's assume that's the environment you're coming into, which again is very common. Um, I would like, and we're jumping ahead too. We're jumping past the like, what kinds of questions are you asking during the interview phase? But maybe it's a surprise. Maybe you land there, you get the job. You knew you were the first designer, but you didn't realize how much debt or how much like sort of unhealthy behavior there is in terms of their product development process. I mean, of course, you're going to go in and do an assessment stage, right? And you're going to get to know your key partners and stakeholders and try to get a feel for what's the lay of the land. But you likely will be hammered with like inbound requests. It's like the day you sit down at your desk,
Yeah.
metaphorically, all these inbound requests are going to come in from just random engineers and PMs like, oh, good, you're here. We've got this project. Can you get an eye on this? It's shipping tomorrow. Um, and so hopefully what you're going to try to do is like win the trust of your boss and make an explicit request. Like there's sort of a precious period in those first like 30 to 90 days where it's a honeymoon period where it's like the proving ground as a new employee. And it's helpful if early on you can ask your boss to help run defense on your behalf and say, listen, uh, new employee Shelby, she's not going to start just jumping into bugs and like reviewing UI. We're going to help try to protect her time and space so that she can have more impact later. Like that's what you're trying to get to ultimately is like not get buried under this pile of like minor UI fixes, which will exist.
Yeah.
But in theory, the company has had something like a tolerance for shipping that stuff for a long time now. And if they can continue to like uh, continue to ship stuff that maybe you as the designer know is not the best it could be, it's going to help you not get like if you allow yourself to get buried, it's a better way of saying it. If you allow yourself to get buried immediately with those like one-off high urgency, low important tasks, you'll never get to like higher leverage, more strategic, more long-term important tasks. And then it's a cycle, which will likely lead to burnout and you being perceived as low, not a high performer, right? Because it's like, what have
Yeah.
you actually delivered for the business? You're getting yourself into a state where you're only known as the like sprinkle some pretty UI at the end. And there's so much volume that you can't even do your best work, even on just the surface UI. So it's a trap. I'm curious what you think of that. Like, have you been in that situation or what do you advise when folks are in that role?
So I've been in that situation before fairly recently. It's not a startup, but we had just spun off a new project, a new major project for the past 3 years. And there's a massive amount of design debt.
Mm-hmm.
So they're finally bringing a designer in because they said, well, we need a user interface for this. Like we have the technology because it's a very deep tech thing. It's like robotics. So you
Mm,
can build the
cool.
robot, you can build all the stuff behind it, the technology, the machine vision, etc. And then at the very end, you're like, let's tack on a user interface because now you need a human being to control it that's not using command prompts, right? Not
Uh-huh.
using an
Yeah.
internal tool. So in that case, you're just bombarded. Like I agree with you. You're bombarded with a ton of stuff to do.
Mm-hmm.
The I guess we're jumping really far ahead here, but
Yeah.
one thing that I find personally to be extremely frustrating is that I agree with you. As a senior IC designer, you want to get to the strategic stuff. You want to do the high leverage stuff. You don't want to get bogged down with the incremental things, the one-offs, right?
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes the business wants you to crank out all the one-offs and they
Yeah.
don't want you to focus on the strategic stuff because they
That's
believe they
right.
have other people who can take care of it.
Yeah.
And if you happen to be a mildly strategic person, you might say, well, that strategy doesn't make any sense. Like you're not taking into account the user side of things because you're not doing user research properly or not at all.
Mm-hmm.
And this strategy, for whatever reason you've seen in the past, is not going to work very well. So you want
Mm-hmm.
to go in there and change the strategy in some way because you
Yeah.
see it as a train that's in the wrong direction and you want to
Yeah.
slowly shift that away, right? But the business again wants you to focus on the incremental things and they measure you that way. And if you try
Yeah.
to do this other strategic stuff, they're like, no, 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 we don't want you to do that. And I think Erica Flowers talked about that 2 weeks ago about
Mm-hmm.
the
I
trial
love that
coding
chat. So
designer.
good. So good. We want
So
hands, not brains. Was that
yeah,
the quote she gave from
basically,
Henry Ford? Yeah.
yeah. So what do you do then? Because the business is being very clear with you that this is the incentive structure.
Yeah.
And even though this might create bad long-term outcomes, we still want you to do this thing. But I
Yeah.
mean, of course, in their mind, this is going to create positive long-term outcomes.
Hmm.
But as a designer or somebody who's more user-centric, you might say, okay, I'm going to put out some red flags. This is not
Yeah.
going to turn out the way you think it is.
That's really good. I think what's interesting is I think I would probably give different advice now in 2024 than I would a few years ago. Because like my thing I'm hammering on is like stay employed, stay employed, stay employed, keep the job, get to be known as a top performer. And it's really it's counter to advice I would have given where like, man, if this gets bad enough, just quit, get another job, like easy for
Yeah.
me to say, right? And that's not the situation we're in right now. And I don't see that changing this year. So I'm all about like help people make smart decisions to one, not burn out and um, stay employed. And like I posted about this recently. And if you want to leave and find another job, do it. But you have the agency. You're the one that's making that decision. Don't come to be known as like a problem employee or a low performer. So yeah, I'd make sure you're really clear on what you've been hired to do also, because what you're describing, it's very possible in this hypothetical org that they didn't even know they were hiring someone that was capable of contributing to strategy conversations. And so when you're even offering that, like I think this is kind of what you're getting at. It's like this isn't what we hired you to do. Like we hired this like surface UI person, which hurts me as a designer. Like we've all been there, right? Where it's like crank out the UIs. Um, and we know that we're capable of so much more. Maybe some of this comes to like a matter of patience. Like I think in that first decade of my career, I was a very impatient IC, and I could see all this stuff that the company was doing wrong and like strategy was wrong. And um, I ran myself ragged trying to influence that things at the orgs that I worked at that I had no power to influence. And I wish I could go back in time and be like, I love where your heart's at. You're doing the right thing for the right reasons, but this is like not energy well spent for you or the company. And in fact, it starts to reflect poorly on you. I think Erica was kind of getting at some of this as well about like when you're the design zealot, that lacks situational awareness about your own org, it ultimately will start reflecting poorly on you and it can lead to burnout. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but if I could advise myself in that situation in the past, which I've been in that situation, I would um, try to encourage myself to be more patient and think like, just get to be known as a top performer first and be clear on like what is your manager on the hook to deliver to the business and what's your manager's manager, and make sure there's really clear conversations and alignment happening there where you can link your work directly to like your manager's objectives and their manager's objectives. um,
Hmm.
and that's just being savvy and smart with your career, and that's part of what we talk about when we talk about managing up. um, and the more crystal clear you are on that, on like what your boss expects of you and how you can help enable them to be more successful, hopefully that leads to less burnout because you're not doing all these other 100 wacky things that could be great for the business, but it's what no one is asking you for.
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail on the head right now. And I'm very much where you were
Okay.
many years ago.
It's
Somebody
so
who
hard.
wants,
Yeah.
it's so hard, right? And part of it is maybe this is very egotistical to think so, but I feel that if I keep doing the same things that, if I keep doing what they want me to do, what they
Mm-hmm.
ask me to do, I'm in some ways creating a pattern. And they just
Mm.
kind of want to, they'll just say, wait, you've been doing this so well for the last year or so. Why would you
Yeah.
want to do things differently? And
Yeah.
another scary thought is if I were to leave and they bring in
Mm-hmm.
another designer, this
Mm-hmm.
designer is going to suffer through the pattern that I've created there. And
Yeah.
I've been that designer before where
Mm-hmm.
I replaced somebody who did all the things that the business asked. And then people like the PMs and the leadership they feel very comfortable. They feel like, okay, I've
Mm-hmm.
managed designers before and this is
Uh-huh.
what the designers gave me
That's
and they were
true.
great.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why can't you do the same things as them? Why can't you be like the other designers?
Uh-huh.
And to me, that's what actually horrifies me in some ways,
Right.
where I'm
You're like,
gonna
I'm
be creating a
sorry.
yeah. So I guess this is the crux of the issue. It's like how do you make that decision between
Mm.
choosing one path or the other? Because at least I think can we
Yeah.
at least agree that you don't want to oscillate between the two. You don't want to do
Mm.
anything half-assed. You want to be no half measures, full
Full
measures
ass.
only,
Yeah.
right? You
Yeah.
either go one route or the other. You either get fired doing this or
Uh-huh.
you become the model employee. But how do you, what's
Hmm.
the, do you have a framework in place to help people come to that decision? Because it's such a private and deeply
Yeah.
personal decision. And people aren't going to listen to you if you just say, do this as a coach.
Yeah. And again, it's super like it's based on the context. How much support do you have within the org? Do you have any partners or advocates that understand your long-term vision of what you're trying to get to? Importantly, do they have any political power at the company? Sometimes I had great support from like senior execs who weirdly, despite their like position in the org, they actually had no influence. But it took me years to figure it out. So I was like, this person's advocating for me when I'm not in the room. They're trying to help me get to that more strategic place. Um, but it took forever to figure out like that person doesn't have any sway with the people who matter. So um, maybe it's a false dichotomy. Maybe it's not an either or. But one thing I recommend people do if it's like, okay, the sets of behaviors that the org has around design right now look like this, and this is what I'm being asked to do, and I can deliver that. But like you said, I'm going to create bad patterning, especially for future designers that they hire. And I have a vision for how we might try to get over here. What I'd advocate is um, if you're not completely buried in work, which you might be completely buried if you're the first designer after many years of this company shipping product. But if there's any breathing room whatsoever, um, get aligned with your boss around this, but try to do like the smallest possible project that's like an internal MVP of what you're trying to get to. And then make sure it delivers results for the business that matter to the business. Make sure it's aligned with, again, that line of reporting and the things that they care about. Make sure it's got the support and alignment from your boss, and hopefully even like influential adjacent partners like product managers, for example. And just what's the minimum viable testing out of this new way of working that you can then sort of like encapsulate into a case study. And now you're on the campaign trail, you're talking at the all hands or engineering all hands. But even better is you're like recruiting your partners, your cross-functional partners, to sing the praises of this experiment that you all did together. So you're like co-creating this experiment around process. And I mean, first you're going to have to like be successful, right? So it can't just be, designers have a habit of talking about design a lot and designers talk to designers about design. We talk about design, but internally at an org, it can sound self-serving, right? It's like, if you're the designer that's like, we need more designers, like anybody is going to advocate for more funding for their function. But if you can like find partners like in PM or Eng or whoever's most influential within your org, and again, that's contextual, and get them to advocate on behalf of what you're asking for, that's much more powerful, especially if they have influence. It's much more powerful than being like, hey, you should let me be more strategic. It's much better to have like a group PM be like, whoa, Shelby delivered this amazing like uh, set of research and it helped us kind of like pivot 5%, but look at the results we got as a result of that change. Um, so the more it can be like a co-creative process with partners, and then they see the magic and then they're advocating on your behalf, and you're kind of like stumping around that case study that's like as small as possible, then you can start to like scale it out if you win support.
I want to ask about support and
Mm-hmm.
influence. You mentioned that there are people that are higher up in the art, but didn't have the influence you were looking for, and it took you a
Mm-hmm.
while to figure that out. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, how do you identify people who do have influence
Yeah,
and who are
that's
also
so good.
supportive?
Yes. I mean, it's usually pretty clear whether or not you have support. I mean, but we can come around to that if you're like, no, it's not clear. The harder thing is figuring out who has influence. And it's not as simple as like how senior are they? Apparently, that's what I learned, right? I was like, you're super
Yeah.
senior, you're an exec. Um, but that's not always the case. So there's like signals that you can look for within your org to try to figure out who's influential. And oftentimes there's people who are highly influential that are not even necessarily that senior. Maybe they've won the trust of the CEO, for example. Maybe there's one like favorite pet PM that like the CEO gets a lot of like one-on-one FaceTime with and like leans heavily on
Yeah.
their point of view. They're trustworthy. Um, so I think it's harder now to figure this stuff out in a remote world, unfortunately, because you can't observe office dynamics. You're not like the
Yeah.
CEO's always walking around with that 1 p.m. and they're getting lunch now. Because that's some of the nice stuff that you get with being in an office.
Yeah.
I wouldn't trade it for the world. I love the remote world. But you're looking for things like, so signals that you can look to try to figure out who actually has influence despite the org chart. And I would even advocate for like take a piece of paper and map out a rough org chart. Don't do this if it's an 8,000 person org, but if you work in like
Hmm.
a 200 person org and maybe R&D that you work inside of is like 40 people or whatever that would be, 50 people, like go ahead and map it out, like, and map you out, your boss, your boss's boss, all the way up to the CEO, and then a couple of adjacent roles on your way up, like key partners, like product or eng if you're a designer, and now like data science, folks like that. Um, and who's getting a bunch of airtime at all hands? Whose
Oh
org
yeah,
continues, right? Who's speaking on behalf of the business? Like almost as though like, oh, the CEO could have given this talk, but instead it's our head of product. That's interesting. Or it's always this like senior PM who's like not even that senior in the business, but like they get a lot of airtime. Who's being given like key initiatives that are critical for the business? Um, who continues to get funding? Who's continuing to grow their org? Um, like who keeps getting budget? Who appears to be like empire building? You know, it's like, well, their org
yeah,
just tripled in a year and everybody else is stagnating. What is that? You know, so it's not a direct um, I guess, causal link, but you're trying to look for signals to try to understand who's influential and map it out on paper
got
and
it.
be like, this person's like senior, but maybe not very influential. Some of it comes from gossip too. It's like, wow, when I get the ear of this person privately, they're like, you know, if you can find trusted people who have worked there longer and have um, more of the history of how things got to be the way they are. And we don't want to gossip. We want to just like get enough information to help us be successful in our role. We're not trying to trash talk. We're just like, hey, it seems like this person's org hasn't grown at all. Like, what do you make of that? Maybe your boss will be able to share a little bit of information about that. So try to figure out who your like trusted allies are, who are relatively good sources of information on things like that.
Got it. So oftentimes I've noticed that in more design immature organizations, especially for B2B enterprise companies, the organizations that typically have a closer tie to the CEO are growing are like on the sales teams
Mm-hmm.
or perhaps marketing
Yeah,
as opposed to product or engineering. Like product
yeah,
engineering are actually in some ways devalued. So
yeah.
they don't really have that influence. In
Mm-hmm.
those cases, how do you navigate it? Because those
Mm.
folks aren't really the people you work the most closely with oftentimes.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
typically don't understand design. Like they don't work with design and they might see you as somebody who just makes things prettier. Like they might see you as a
Mm-hmm.
marketing designer, if anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I think one thing that, and I agree, I've worked in orgs like that. I think Cisco was sometimes an org like that, where it was like predominantly when we joined, it was mostly like a sales machine with like
Yeah.
engineering kind of feeding sales things to sell. Apologies to any Cisco people who are listening. It's improved a lot since then, but that was sort of the state of things. One idea, so I like to toss out a lot of different ideas, right? It's like you could do this, you could do this, you could do this, give a half a dozen different ideas, and hopefully at least one will resonate or be the seed of an idea that you can take and run with. Because again, there's so many different types of orgs that you'll have to make your own discernment about what makes sense for you. But in an org like that, you could use PMM, like product marketing managers. So it's like they're kind of your bridge over from the product org, like R&D product org. They're your bridge over into like sales and marketing, if that's the more influential org. And because they're that connective tissue between like your design, PM, PMM, and then your marketing and sales, they can often translate what you're hearing, right? Like you might hear things coming out of the sales org, for example, that are completely foreign to you, that just doesn't, it's not the language that we might use in design day to day, but they can help translate. And if you can get like a peer or a partner that's willing to just go get lunch with you, spend time with you, get the occasional one-on-one and chat with you and help you make sense of things, that could be helpful. And they could be that translator of like, hey, you're in PMM, who's influential over on that side of the org? Like who are the people that
Right.
carry a lot of influence in marketing? And then you might be able to ask to attend the marketing all hands or watch recordings of old marketing department all hands and like take note of the language they use, take note of what their metrics are they're reporting on. This is advice I give generally anyway. It's like if you're attending an all hands where execs are reporting out the state of the business, make note of the language, make note of the metrics they're reporting on, and try to find ways to like connect the dots between your work and what they're reporting on and lean on your manager to help you do that. But in an org like that, you can lean on PMM I also, I'm talking a lot, and I realize there's probably like stuff in the chat that could steer us in a direction that might be more helpful for folks. So let me know if there's a direction you see that we should go in. But yeah, there was one other thought I had around that. PMM. Oh, one great thing that I recommend people do is get time with finance. So this is something that I did at Duo Security. It's something I did at Cisco. It's just not a common move that I see designers doing, but like make buddies with finance. So maybe there's an analyst, or if it's a tiny org, maybe you could even, if there's like a, get mentorship from a C-level executive 6-month program kind of thing. Like maybe you could get mentorship from the CFO. So go for like non-obvious folks that you might not naturally gravitate to or be more comfortable with. But I started to spend time with the finance folks, and what was incredible was, one, I wanted to like increase my fluency with like business language and understand like the metrics and all these things and what's reported on. But two, this is like an aside maybe, but when I talked to them, I was like, how can we be better partners to finance? And what they talked about sounded exactly like design. They're like, we're not just here to like approve expense reports at the last hour. It's like, we're not just here to do UI right before it ships. Like pull us in as partners early as possible and talk about your strategy for how you want to deploy budget. So by the time we get to an approval, we know the context and we know what that is. We can help you write budget proposals for things that you want to do. We can co-create. So the more you can like make buddies with folks in finance, which is maybe not a natural pairing that you would see unless you're being deliberate about it, you can learn a lot about the business, and it's great to have them as like partners.
Oh my God, where were you 5 years ago? I needed you in my life. I was so confused back then. I was like, why are we doing things this way? This makes zero sense. There's zero product initiative behind this. But
I
yeah,
mean, that might have also been true. Sometimes companies do things that make no sense too. That's a
but
possibility.
yeah, my mistake was that I did not make friends with the PMFs.
Mm.
And we were very much a sales and marketing driven organization. We were owned
Mm-hmm.
by private equity.
Oh yeah.
And so I didn't really like at the time I didn't make those connections. I didn't realize that we were trying to hit those crazy growth targets
Mm-hmm.
because it was kind of like a slash and burn. Like we're being put on steroids. Either we're gonna grow to that size that they really want us to be at, or we're gonna die trying.
That's
And
so rough.
yeah, but they're doing okay. And I just, I definitely could have used a lot of the advice that you're putting out right now.
Mm.
So we can go in any directions now because I feel like we got so deep in the weeds and it's super, super
Awesome.
helpful. And I hope that other people are getting the same kind of value that are making the connections in my brain, like
Cool.
the same way that I'm making it right now. So you talk quite a bit about managing up in your LinkedIn
Mm-hmm.
post, and
Mm-hmm.
this is going to be a core component of your coaching or leadership coaching. What does that mean exactly? Because right
Yeah.
now it sounds like it's not just managing up directly to your manager, but actually working with all these disparate functions in your company that you have almost zero connections with from
Mm-hmm.
from the outsider on paper at least.
Yeah. I think it's like, yeah, my focus in 2024 is like hammering on managing up, hammering on keep your job, control your employment. You get to make the choice when it's time to leave, and managing up as a tool to do that, hopefully. I think sometimes managing up, I think when I think about it, what it's not is being manipulative. It's not brown nosing. It's not that. It's more like being super strategic about understanding the context in which you're operating inside the business. And we talked about that, right? Revenue models and incentive structures for people's behavior. Um, Understanding who has influence within the org. Um, Developing trust, like developing a really like trusting relationship between you and your boss. And that there's a lot of caveats there, right? You might have an ineffective boss who's kind. You might have a toxic boss who's super effective in the org. There's all different permutations of that. But I want to help people develop enough organizational awareness that they can get really clear on what are the things they do have control over and what are the things they don't have control over. And it's like you might apply that logic in other areas of your life, right? It's like the things I can't control, I'm just going to let it go. But what I can control, here's how I optimize for that. And how am I going to be
Mhm.
strategic about how I'm using my energy? And managing up is like being strategic about how you use your energy at work and making sure you're like really clear on your boss's objectives and how are they being measured in terms of success in their role on up the chain, right? Like how will your boss's boss measure your boss's performance, and how can you help support that? And there's some like really easy stuff that people could do right now. Some of this was inspired by like a direct report I had at LinkedIn, because he did this with me. He was awesome. Like, he, ahead of a one-on-one, he just slacked me and he was like, hey, what are your OKRs coming up for this quarter, and like, how can I help support them? And like, I don't know that anyone had ever asked me that before, and I'd been managing teams for like over a decade at that point, and I was like, whoa, that's the most incredible question. I'm like, oh, he wants to help me. um I just thought it was so savvy, to be like, hey, I want to help you be successful and I want to learn more about the business. What are your OKRs? How can I build like one of my OKRs as something that helps support you shipping your OKRs? And so we like crafted that plan together. But it reflected so well on him to have that like awareness and build that type of relationship where he's like, I'm also invested in you and your success. So I don't want this to be misconstrued as like, I don't know, like being overly ingratiating towards your manager or anything like that. It's just like, the fact is your manager has had 10 meetings today, and your 30-minute one-on-one is one of the 10 meetings. And I think as ICs, I definitely had this like very egocentric idea of like, my manager's completely focused on me all the time. In fact, your manager's probably fighting fires and there's like crazy stuff that they're managing that they're not allowed to talk to you about. So like, they just came from a meeting where they're like, oh, everything's falling apart. Okay, now here we are. We're having a one-on-one. I want to be a present, kind, compassionate manager. What can I help you with? So just to the degree that you're like, I want to take stuff off your plate and help you be successful and deliver on your objectives, so you look like a high performer to your boss, it like elevates the whole org. Um, I want to say, was it Dan Mall who was recently talking about this? I think I saw a teaser. He's on Beyond UX, the podcast that's coming up, and I'm looking forward to listening to that, where he's talking about the same thing. Like, if you could help elevate your manager, that sort of lifts the whole org, so you're like coming along with it. So yeah, talk to your boss, like give them a heads up ahead of your next one-on-one and say, I want to talk about what you're on the hook to deliver to the business or your OKRs, and how can I help support that? And that's like a good first step in terms of managing up.
I love that. That's so important. And I want to get to a lot of the questions that people are asking right now. I know Ross asked a
Cool.
great question around, how do you define top performer? But I'm going to be selfish. I'm going to ask one more question that's in line with what you mentioned earlier. You said you can have a boss that's ineffective, but very kind.
Yeah.
And that just connect a few
Tough.
dots for me, right?
Oh,
Because
okay. Yeah.
we're all trying to find good bosses, and for
Yeah.
me personally, one of the core requirements is this person's not an asshole. This person needs
Totally.
to be kind, and then the
Yeah.
second requirement is they have clout within the organization, so they're actually
That's right.
effective at what they do.
Yeah.
But how do you identify those things early on in the interview process? Because we
Mm.
often don't get enough time in the interview stages to really interview
Mm-hmm.
our managers and really get to know them, because it
Yeah.
can take time to figure out, do they have that clout within the organization? How do you try to identify that early on so you don't end up with someone who's quite kind but may not
Mm-hmm.
have the effectiveness to help push you to get things done?
That's so good. I want to spend more time thinking on that too, because I bet I could come up with better answers if I marinate on it some more. Because you can't come in and be
Sure.
like, you seem nice, but let's be real. Are you a
Yeah.
chucklehead or not? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, you could, but and they also might not have the awareness that they're ineffective. So one of my great mentors, right? One of his
Yeah.
quotes that I quote often, his name's Chester. He said, performance issues by and large are like, the root cause has to do with the lack of self-awareness. And I think that's so true. So like, you might even be getting hired by a kind manager who's ineffective, who believes that they're effective. And that's a bigger problem. It would be better if they're like, I know I'm not effective, and I know these are the gaps, and I need your help to partner. Um,
Hmm.
so off the top of my head, I love this question. Like, what can you ask in an interview to try to ferret out what's the actual dynamic that you're coming into? I don't have a great off the top of my head answer, but one thing that comes to mind is like something around like, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing in terms of design at this org, what would it be? And ask everybody that question. Like, ask the engineering person that interviews you, ask the product person that interviews you. If they all give the same answer, that's some kind of interesting signal, right? Um,
Hmm.
if everybody gives the same answer except for your boss, and your boss is giving something kind of bizarre and random, that's interesting signal. Um, a lot of times the answers to that question have to do with either perception or just the experience of being a designer within the org. Um, I'll think on that. If I come up with a better answer,
Yeah.
which I suspect I will, I'll post about it.
Yeah, why don't we can skip it for now and we can start taking some of the Q&As. People,
Sure.
everyone, if if you have any questions, please put them into the chat. We'll be able to see them and answer them. The first one's by Ross, and I think this is great. You mentioned being a top performer. How do you define that? How does an
Mm,
IC evaluate that for themselves? Because you mentioned that
it's good.
oftentimes we are not aware of our
Yeah.
own performance, right? So,
Yeah.
and also, you mentioned quite a bit about what do you define as top performer in terms of getting certain things done that the
Hmm.
influencers really care about versus
Yeah.
something that's actually on your job description.
Yeah. I know there's a formal definition of top performer, especially if you're in a more mature org that has these like
Yeah.
scoring spreadsheets and whatnot. And then there's the more informal cultural version of that, where it's like if somebody says your name and you're not in the room, you kind of want everybody to be like, oh, she's amazing. Like she's so good.
Yeah.
If we could just get her on this project, it'd be so helpful. Um, so thank you for the question, Ross. It's a good one. It's an important one for people to start like learning more about how this works at your particular org. If you do anything more formal, like performance reviews, um, sometimes there's scores, it's like meets most expectations, exceeds most. Oftentimes, your manager is scoring you in that way, but you don't see the score. So you might be scored on whether or not you're like exceeds expectations consistently. Um, it might come through as like a little bit of a bonus during performance reviews. However, in 2024 and 2023, we're seeing hiring freezes and layoffs, and we're seeing that a lot of the existing employees that stay behind, they're asked to do more work and they're just not getting any kind of promotion or compensation increases because budgets are frozen as well. So you can't use that necessarily, whether or not you got it. Like if you got money, that might be a signal that you're a top performer. If you didn't get it, it might not mean anything. It might just mean that almost nobody got anything. Um, but one thing you can do when you're interviewing is like, what does great performance in this role look like? What would a top performer,
Yeah.
how does that look? Like ask about that ahead of time and then continue to have that conversation through onboarding with your boss. Like, okay, when we interviewed, you're a month in maybe to a new role. When we interviewed and I asked this question, here's what you came back with. Do you have any other thoughts on that for me? Like now that I know more about this initiative I'm on, what would great performance as I'm supporting this initiative look like? What's the desired dream state? So, and that's a conversation of alignment, right? Like making sure you have your own idea what top performance might look like, but your boss might have a different vision of that. Um, and ideally, if you do anything that's like a performance management conversation with your boss, like yearly annual reviews or twice a year reviews, where they're sitting down and doing the structured, stressy one-on-one, where they're like, we're going to talk about your performance now. This is advice to any leaders on the call, but hopefully there's no surprises in that conversation. You should never be saying something for the first time during a performance review. Hopefully you're just restating things that you've said repeatedly months over months during one-on-ones. That this person is, well, it's like, we've been working on this thing. We want you to be presenting to larger audiences. We've been building your presentation skills. So that's something we're going to continue working on. So leaders on the call, if you're surprising people during performance reviews, that's something for you to work on. Make sure there's no surprises. What else? Top performer. I mean, you might be getting assigned to like really critical initiatives. That's like one bit of signal. I would prefer that like folks are having really uh, just frank conversations with their boss about their performance repeatedly. Um, and that's probably the best signal is like, how does your boss consider your performance? However, I wouldn't, this is just me personally. Maybe it's, I don't know. I'm like an introvert. I don't want to be surprised in the moment because I want to give thoughtful answers to my directs. But I think if you're going to have a more sensitive conversation, like how am I performing in the role, give your boss a heads up. Like this is just good advice in general
Right.
anyway. If you're going to ask an important question or unexpected question in a one-on-one, give them a Slack a couple days ahead of time and say, hey, I'd love to check in on how I'm doing in my role. What is anything I need to be working on or focusing on to be considered a top performer? Can we talk about that on Thursday? So give them a heads up so that you actually get a high quality answer instead of them rambling and bumbling in the moment like I would do if people surprised me with that question.
I love that. And the mistake that we talked about earlier was I like to ask questions at all hands. And
You
that
do?
never works out. I do. I ask like what is the
CEO,
strategy
defend your
behind
position. Yeah.
yeah. It never
Yeah,
works out. You look like an ass afterwards. So I've learned my
you do. I've
lessons.
actually gotten in trouble doing that as well. Like surprising, like getting to know your partners and what their psycho. So designers were good at this, right? Like we understand deeply behavior and motivations and goals. Do that for your colleagues. Do that for your leaders. It's like this person doesn't like to get surprised in a group setting. Go talk to them private. Also, that's another tip. It's like if you want alignment on something different, go align one-on-one with everybody privately first, and then do the big reveal at the group setting
Yeah.
where everybody's already looking around, nodding their heads because you already had the chat.
I think designers are the best at doing this, or talking about doing this with the users, and then absolutely
Yeah,
applying none of it to their coworkers or other people. It's
right. But
as
it's
if
kind of
like their coworkers aren't people.
right. But that's the awesome opportunity. It's like, oh, we've had it all along. Oh my gosh, all we have to do is like turn this way and do the same thing we've been doing. Great, we already have the skills.
Yeah,
Coworkers are humans
but
too.
this comment from Phil. Hey Phil, what if
Hey,
your
Phil.
design leader is territorial and guarded
Oh,
about providing insights?
so
So
bad. Yeah.
yeah, and I wanted to ask about that earlier. Like, oftentimes the most influential person at your organization might
Yeah.
be a disbeliever of design. They
Hmm.
might see it as a distraction, as something that
Yeah.
slows it down, and you could just spend so much time trying to convince them otherwise, and they just don't want to be convinced. They just don't care.
Hmm.
So, what do you do if you're in the situation that Phil is describing?
That's so rough. Like if they're being territorial, they're hoarding information, they're hoarding power. That's going to create all kinds of problems. It's not just like, oh, I won't be able to understand who's influential at the org. He's saying guarded about providing insights into who are allies. Yeah. I mean, that's like troublesome enough to me where I might start looking for a new role, like not immediately, but if this is enough of a problem, like it's difficult to be successful in a situation where your leader is hoarding power to the degree that they're willing to undermine their own people. That's really troublesome, and it definitely does happen. So that might be a situation where like um it's like you always want to keep your job in parallel while you're on the job search, but that one could be troublesome enough where it's like worthy of getting out of what I see as a toxic environment. I hope I'm understanding the question well enough. But you could also look at this one could backfire, but you could look at moving like to an adjacent org if there's a possibility there. Um, this one has me worried. I'm worried for Phil. Phil, are you
uh,
okay?
I think Phil has an update on that. Let me try to find it. I think he said he left the organization eventually.
Ooh,
Are they? Yeah. So it just doesn't sound like it was a happy ending, unfortunately.
I can't
I ended
imagine
up
like how
being
it
laid
could be.
off from that role eventually.
That sucks.
LOL. Yeah. Yeah, you
Sorry,
do learn a
Phil.
lot through this kind of collective trauma.
Yeah, it is traumatic. I'm glad people are talking really openly about layoffs and how and like mental health and how that's tied in with it because it's really I've been laid off. It's a scary moment and it's scary when it's just looming in the ether generally because none of us feel very comfortable or safe.
No, there's no safety in that. Oh, Ario
Ario.
asks if you're hired by person A and trust is established. Oh my God, this has happened to me a few times.
Okay. If you're hired
Love
by
to hear
person
your thoughts
A,
on, yeah,
when they leave,
person A
oh,
leaves.
oh my gosh. Okay. I have a move for this, and this is true of changing managers too. Hi, Ario. I'm buddies with Ario. Um, before person A leaves, ask to have a one-on-one with person A and person B. So this is whether they're leaving or whether you're changing managers, but do a three-person one-on-one. And you're basically, you as the direct report are silent and you're recruiting. Person A has nothing to lose. You're like, help me out. So person A is going to sing your praises. This is a full hour one-on-one, not 30 minutes. Person A is going to talk about how badass you are, what you delivered, all your growth, your career trajectory at the company, how you're about to get promoted to senior and they're expecting person B to support that move and you've ticked all the boxes, you're just waiting for the budget to come out, whatever's going on career-wise. You're making explicit ask. It's okay to ask people to help you in this way with your career, especially if they're leaving. It's like, what do they have to lose? Unless they're leaving on bad terms and that they've burned all the bridges and people are like, don't trust what they say. If they still have respect and trust within the org, ask them to basically hype man you for an hour to person B and just like fill up that trust well as fast as possible. So you're not starting from zero, and do that when you change managers too. And managers on the call, do that for your people. If you're losing a direct to a new person, do them that solid hour of just like talking to that new boss in front of them so they know it's happening too. It's embarrassing and awkward for the person to listen to this stuff for an hour, but it's a huge gift and it's very little effort for you.
I would die. I would just absolutely die.
I
I
know it's
would
like,
just plug my ears. I would like hide in the corner. But I love that. That is amazing advice. What if person A quits, puts in their notice, and they're not able
mhm.
to backfill that role in time before they
Yeah,
leave? Is
I see.
there
So
a
there's
way
no
for person
overlap.
A? No overlap. Can they? Is there like another person they can act
Yeah,
that can act as a messenger, or maybe a document?
that's good. I'm trying to think now. That's really smart. I wonder if you could either get it's going to be limited, right? But you could, in theory, get person A to still do the one-on-one, even though they're like, now I work at this other company. I'm not an employee. So they'll be limited in terms of like whatever NDA they've signed. But they didn't sign an NDA to talk about how awesome you are in theory. They're not like, that's private information.
Yeah.
So that's a big ask, right? If it's not employee time, it's not their time on the clock at that company. Um, this is a weird one I just came up with. So we'll see if I like this in another week, but you could ask them to record like a Zoom of themselves doing this, like, I'm speaking to you from the past. Or if you're listening to this
Oh my
message, I've left the
God.
company. If you've been hired, but I want you to, oh, just use AI to fake one of those. We have that now, right?
Yeah,
Han
we
was an
do.
incredible employee. He should be senior principal designer. Just like fake their voice and their mouth moving.
Oh my God.
It got
That's
sinister at the end of the
brilliant.
live.
This is brilliant. This is
I don't
absolutely
know. Don't do
brilliant.
that, guys. That's not good. I feel nervous
Oh my
about that.
God.
But
You
I
know,
like the
we
idea of
had
having
a
them record the convo before they leave, like parting thoughts on this person's career progression. One thing I did, I have to give myself credit. Before I left LinkedIn, I put in a ton of time to write up like not bonus, but like out of cycle performance evaluations for every employee and capture it in the Workday or whatever Hellscape tool they're using, just to be like, this person's awesome. He's on track for senior. He should go up for promotion. He's checked all the boxes. Here's the docs. As a like, it was a lot of extra work, but I was like, this is me doing them a solid. So whoever is going to be my backfill, I was kind of like prepping for that move. So I did it in a written form, not a video form, which is probably more effective anyway. It's like put it officially in the Workday tool that's used to track performance.
That's brilliant. And that's like very kind of you as well. Not a lot of managers who
Thanks.
actually put that kind of effort in, especially if they're leaving. Most managers are like, you know what? I'm out. This is like I'm like a super senior. Like this is me slacking off the next 2 weeks or so.
Senioritis. That's like part of
Yeah.
having integrity as a leader. It's like you're invested in your people no matter what. I'm like, I'm invested in my people forever. I'm still investing in people I led 10 years ago.
This is amazing. Thank you so much. We're almost at time now. I wish we can continue forever, but I definitely
It was
want to
fun.
put in a little bit of um, putting some information about you as well, because right now
Thank
you
you.
are a leadership coach, and I feel like the past hour I've been coached a bit.
That's awesome.
I
Thanks.
definitely want. I wish I knew all this stuff 5 years ago, because I would have my career would have been a little bit different. So we can
Same.
find you on your website, on your Substack, your newsletter, and of course LinkedIn. We can follow you there as well. Is there
Thank you.
anything else that you like to talk about or plug in the remaining time?
That's it. I just appreciate everybody who dropped in live. And I don't know if there's anything major that we missed, like hit me up on LinkedIn. And I'm always happy to like tune my posts based on what's resonating, what's not, and what people think they get a lot of value out of. So let me know. Let me know what's valuable and I can try to do more posting around that.
Will you include illustrations in your posts more and more often? Because we saw one, I really liked it.
Thank you. I'm trying to. I'm trying to like make it more. I had that post it somewhere. I'll do more doodles this year in my posts. It's
Yeah,
fun.
they're really cool. Anyway,
Thanks.
well, thank you so much for today. I learned so much. I hope everybody else has learned some stuff as well. And we can find you on those platforms. Thank you. Thank you. You've been so generous with your time.
Thanks so much. This is so fun. Bye, everybody.
Take care, everyone.